What is up, you guys? Welcome to Word First Radio, the podcast brought to you by Word First Ministries. I am your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friends Cameron and Bailey.
Yo.
Bailey, pray us in, man.
Of course. Lord, we just devote this time to you and pray that you would be in our hearts, be in our minds as we speak, so that we might be wiser men than we currently are when we're done with this conversation. So, Lord, we love you, and we set our minds on you right now. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, man. So last time we had one of my Norwegian friends named Endre on, and we had a long conversation about lots of different things, but we were all kind of like circling this kind of one topic of the meaning of life and how that looks from a atheistic kind of naturalist perspective and how that looks from a Christian theistic perspective. There was a lot we talked about, but there was also things mentioned from everyone that we never got the chance to get to. And I was like, man, it would be really great if we could like chase that for a little bit, but we can't because this episode's already too long. So there are some things that I have written down that for us to unpack and kind of go through. But there was one thing I have to apologize to both of you because I robbed you of the opportunity at the end of that episode to answer Endres Question. More like time robbed it from us.
I've thought about it every moment since then, actually.
Yeah. But we reconciled. It's okay, right?
Nope.
Okay. So I want to go ahead. Endre asked me a question earlier that week and asked me the same question on the podcast, which is, if your worldview changed, say you became like an atheist tomorrow, what would change about your life? This is a really interesting question because I remember there was a story a couple years ago. I think the guy still goes around and does like TED Talks or whatever. But he was a former Christian pastor who was asked after one of his worship services, what kind of difference does God make in your life? And his answer, I didn't think was great. His answer was, I can't really think of anything. So how about I try and live a year without God in my life?
Oh, yeah.
And guess what his conclusion was?
It didn't matter.
It didn't really matter. It didn't change. It didn't change whether or not I believed in God or not. So that's a very interesting story. You can just Google what I'm talking about. Pastor tries a year without God, and you can find the story from his words and also a conversation he had with Sean McDowell actually about that book. But let's kind of talk about our own lives, right? What difference does God make? If we changed our minds tomorrow and became atheists, how would our lives change?
Gosh, that's really hard to say. So it's one thing to... Yeah, that's a difficult question. So if I became an atheist tomorrow, how would I change? It's really hard to know because so much of my... I still have the same moral instincts. And most of my... I've got a whole like morality talk that's in my head that I want to talk about, which is not really that important. I'll just say most of my moral instincts, I think, would be the same. It's not the case that... so it's true. It's true that if God didn't exist, that there's no ground for morality and goodness. But that doesn't mean that if tomorrow decided to be an atheist, that I therefore would live as though goodness and morality weren't true. And I think that's all things because God is real and because part of the human constitution is a sense of goodness and virtue. But how does my life change tomorrow? Like, I don't start robbing banks and shooting people. Like, I don't shoot the guy who's going to take my parking spot or just take what I want or live sort of a fully immoral libertine lifestyle. I think as far as what my life looks like, that also I'm here as a missionary with the IMB, right? So if I'm convinced that God doesn't exist, I probably would have to find a new line of work. But I don't think it's the case that you become an atheist and most of the, how do I explain it? Say the texture of my life is that different. I think I'd work and I would protect and provide for my family as best I could and try and raise my children to be virtuous and love my wife and all of that. But I guess I probably would be whistling while I work, right? I recognize that whole history of humanity and the whole history of myself and my family like we talked about last time, really can be reduced to a chemical equation. And in the light of the existence and eventual death of the universe, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So then what's different about my life is my eternity, the purpose of this life. So I guess I kind of shrugged it off. Instead of a missionary, I guess I wouldn't have to do that. But like, we've talked a lot about what is the purpose of our lives. And the way that I put mine is to be maximally useful for the kingdom of God. Well, then my life just doesn't have that focus anymore, right? So I don't know. There's a lot to say. I haven't, obviously haven't prepared a good answer to the question because I wasn't aware that you're going to ask that one first. But yeah, I mean, how does life change? It's like the whole the foundation of my life gets ripped up, and so I walk around happily in midair.
Yeah. No, well, I guess similar to my answer was that I wouldn't, like, my moral compass wouldn't, like, do a 180 overnight.
Right.
But I would definitely go insane. Like, I would, because, listen, like, what you'd have to learn, because even in your answer, like what you just said, like, you were just like, no, I'd raise my children to live virtuous lives. Whatever that means.
Yeah.
Whatever a virtuous life means. Like, okay, wow. Now I have to define, I guess all I was ever doing was defining for myself what was virtuous, but then what authority do I have in this? And like, oh wait, when I see like moral atrocities happening in the other world, like I have no grounds to say whether or not, like all I can say is, no, I don't like that. It's just gross and icky to me.
Yeah.
I'd drive myself crazy trying to like lie to myself and delude myself that anything I was doing was important or that anything that I believed was right was actually right instead of like just my opinion. Because I don't feel the way that I feel about moral atrocities like I do about like what brand of soda is like my favorite.
Right.
Like, but like when moral atrocities happen, like human beings, we get together and we protest or we stand up for the oppressed and injustice that's happening around the world.
We stand up
against
for the injustice.
Yeah, for the injustice.
Stand up for the injustice.
Against the injustice. But I think that I think that once you rip out like my whole foundation for morality, human rights, meaning, or anything like that, like which is God and the Christian worldview, now it's kind of like, okay, I can't pretend like I can't pretend like I haven't seen what I've seen. Like what I've seen is the absurdity of life without God. So now we've ripped out God. So now what I'm left is like what I would say is like definitely a really absurd, meaningless, non-morally neutral, which is horrible because the world we know isn't morally neutral. So I'm just saying that like I would drive myself crazy. Like I can't pretend like no. Like I made all these arguments for why life is absurd without God to encourage belief in God, but now that God's out of the equation, like no. Like life is. Well, maybe life really isn't absurd without God. Like, no, I would just say, like, no, life is absurd. And yeah.
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking, right? So it's like, okay, so then do you start, imagine whatever do you start hurting people tomorrow because you realize that morality is an illusion? I don't think so. I think I don't hurt people. I don't like to. I don't want to. The idea of like causing somebody pain makes me recoil. I don't think that changes in my heart tomorrow. Maybe my conscience does devolve, but I can't imagine what that's like. But what that brings me to is this problem where it's like, oh, well then everything's absurd. You've just taken out the foundation for existence. So it's a hard thing for me to even imagine what that would be like. You do know what I mean? It's like God's part of my background knowledge. So it's like asking, what if existence went away tomorrow? What would that be like for you? I'm like, I can't. It's hard for me even to make sense of such an existence. It's hard for me to even make sense of such a concept of what would existence be like if existence went away. So it's like, well, if you decided tomorrow you were convinced that God wasn't real, that's like, well, I think I'd be wrong about that. And yeah, so I don't know. That's a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
You guys are way gooder men than me. So like to piggyback on some of our conversation last week, in like an ultimate or a theological sense, I think I'd still agree that we can't find a meaning of life without God. So if the meaning of life basis was just torn out, then I would search for tons of meanings in life. So my family and, all the things that temporarily hold us over, that we Christians claim aren't sustainable, but they'll feel good for a little bit. So I would just live life with a ton of those. Ultimately, and then like in a practical sense, when Endre asked us that last week, my mind started getting really creative, and I'm like, this could be awesome. So like, I don't know, to just break it down to 3 branches. Like, first of all, practically, I would move to Hawaii, and I'd convince all my family and friends who I cared about, including you guys, to move there with me.
Yeah.
Because, I love Norway. Norway's awesome, but nothing is Hawaii. So, 1, I'd move to Hawaii and bring everyone with me. 2, I would do basically, like, my highest motivator would be whatever puts a smile on Grace and Shep's face. So if they're smiling and happy, then I'm doing that thing and sprinting in that direction. And then 3rd, I would switch right back into gear of where I left off as an atheist, except I'd be a better atheist this time. And I would start preaching the gospel of there is no God, and walk into churches and religious services. And obviously, like, I wouldn't care that much to where, I'd move to Norway for it, because since we believe God is real and he's the center and everything of our lives, then he can tell us to do crazy things like move to Norway, and we do it. So I wouldn't have that huge compelling force, but I would have, I know for certain, a desire to still be evangelizing in some sense, but in the sense that I'd be like, hey, all you deceived worshipers, like, it's tragic what you guys are doing. Like, you got 80 years, live them well. Like, stop wasting your time in a building 3 days out of the week, and let's get out of here and enjoy Hawaii together and just like, there is no party in heaven, there's a party on earth, and you're missing it. So I'd definitely be doing that, but not too, I wouldn't be too strongly forced to do it. I would just be in my free time and be like, hey, how's it going? And then, there's one other thing I was thinking. I don't, just like you were saying, our conscience may devolve. I think absolutely mine would. And we'd have, like you're saying, like, we'd still have our own conscience. So even if I don't have an explanation for why I have this conscience and have these morals in my mind and heart, I'd still have them nonetheless. So if I found out tomorrow, okay, God isn't real and I believe that, then I would not start killing people tomorrow.
Right.
But I'd definitely be headed in the direction of, well, when it suits me, like, I'm going to kill people.
Yeah.
Like, if someone messes with Shepherd, then, like, I'm not waiting for a judge to deal with this. Like, no, I'll chop that dude's head off and we'll flee to a different country if we have to. Like, just...
Wow, that's on the record. Okay.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, I'm just saying...
No, I get it. Yeah.
I totally would, like, devolve, and, like, my conscience wouldn't be tomorrow different to where I'd start acting totally differently. But basically, I would feel like all the restraints are off, and it's like, okay, we can literally question anything, and there's really, like, no reason for why I act good in this way. And I know that naturally that would just, things would get looser and looser over time, and yeah, I would serve and love myself and my family, and it would be awesome.
Well, well,
it would be awesome on Earth.
On Earth, yeah.
Until I find out that God is real, past Earth.
So remember we talked to Marius, and Marius said, like, he's like, I think it's literally irrational not to believe that God exists. And his perspective or his opinion is that it's more rational to believe in God's existence even than his own. He's like, it's possible that I am a figment in God's imagination. It's not possible that he's a figment of mine. And I might agree with that. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it long enough. But I find myself wondering, like, I don't know what evidence could convince me God doesn't exist. I can imagine evidence that could convince me that Christianity wasn't true. We could if we found Jesus' bones, that's a big problem, right? So there are a number of those things where if certain kinds of evidence came in, I'd have to change my mind about Christian theism. But I don't know that I even could be persuaded that God doesn't exist, because I think without God you don't get consciousness. I think without God you don't get free will. But I'm just so certain that I'm conscious and that my will is at least sometimes free that I don't know that I could even be persuaded that there wasn't some being at least powerful enough to create beings who are able to, like us, who are able to exercise free will in a causal chain, are able to break a causal chain sort of metaphysically and exercise free will, and for non-physical consciousness to be a thing that exists. I don't know that I'm so convinced that you need to have God, or at least a sufficiently powerful creator for those things to exist. I don't know that I could do it.
Yeah, I couldn't.
I could become a pantheist or something. I mean, I couldn't today, but I could imagine the right kind of evidence coming in where I'd be persuaded of deism or pantheism or something, and then have to wrestle with but all this other particular theism stuff but that's hard to imagine. But I don't know that I could believe God doesn't exist.
I don't know about pantheism for me. We'd have to talk about that. But so it's possible, right? Like I could be persuaded that Christianity is not true. I mean, I'm having a real hard time trying to think of what exactly would convince me God doesn't exist. Because I mean, even to talk about things like existence, our ability to reason and understand each other,
right? Like
you just talked about consciousness, right? Like our consciousness to perceive each other in the world. Like, I mean, like it would be like you run into this like bootstrapping problem where it's like literally the medium by which we're discussing the argument that proves God doesn't exist, like proves that God exists. And so I'd have a hard time really wrapping my mind around God not existing. So, but that's anyway. We could talk about our favorite arguments for the existence of God.
Can I?
Yeah,
go ahead. So I would say, like, I think if I consider myself to be a solely logical, reasonable man, then I definitely, I definitely agree with you guys. But especially knowing, because have you guys? Would you say you were ever non-believers at a point in your life? Like, I know...
I don't think so. I don't think I can say I can't point at a time in my life.
So maybe not believers in the cross and like people who can explain the gospel and know that you're saved. But would you say that you've ever had a point in your life where you didn't believe that God was a part of everything?
No, I don't think so. I can't remember a time. Yeah.
So like as a guy who totally was there at one point, I think if I include in the discussion that I am an emotional and like all these other parts of being a human besides just our brains thinking logically and reasonably, like I think I could definitely be persuaded, not in the sense of reason, but in the sense of either something happens in my life where God lets me down or, I'm just totally wrecked and my heart shifts to a willingness and even a desire to believe that he doesn't exist. Yeah. Like, I think that could totally happen.
I get that.
And I could go down that road.
Yeah.
I definitely would. Like, he's freaking real.
Yeah. I get that too. But that's where, like, the delusion part of it comes into me. Like, I think that, like, you've talked about, like, your testimony before where you're like, you used to think like the people worshiping God, like in the building, like these are the brainwashed like slaves. I'm like, no, I think that's the other way. Yeah. Like with if you want to say that like, okay, if I turn off the logical side of it and go with like purely pragmatic or emotional reasons for like, no, like I'm an atheist and I'm going to keep living my subjective, like that's the slavery delusion in my mind. Well, I just said some controversial. I respect any atheist listeners right now, and of course respect my friend Endre, but I do think that definitely lends itself more towards like no, I'm pretending like all those like logical reasons might not exist, and not every atheist does that, but those who do, I'm going to pretend like my emotional drive to just do what I want, or pretend the things that have meaning in my life have meaning. Like that's going to be what drives me to do that, even though they don't actually have meaning. These things might not actually be morally right, and God might actually exist. I'm going to ignore that and just be driven by this emotional thing. I think that's the real slavery and delusion, I would say. Well, if we don't have anything more to say about that, we can go ahead and move on to something else that kind of on this like morality kind of thing. So Endre was talking about like how about there are different societies in the world that have different moral standards, right?
Yeah.
So like there are certain cultural taboos around like self-defense in the U.S. and of course in Norway as well. And the example he used from his mouth was that self-defense might be more acceptable in the U.S. And in Norway, it's killing someone with a gun in Norway is he was saying like it's more of a bigger deal, or it's more of a if you want to claim self-defense, that's going to be a harder fight to fight in Norway or something like that. I don't have any of the political details around it, but that's a comparison he made. On the morality question, just in general, right? Talking about there are moral differences in other cultures, and the subjective kind of system of morality is better because on your guys' view, you're just trying to say like, well, God told me this, and that's enough for me. What do we kind of think about that? I know I have a lot of thoughts to say about that, but
I think it's an easy thing to believe, but I think it's ultimately false. So I think Endres' judgment was, well, look, he in fact, he just said it. He goes, we live in a morally relativistic world. Yeah. And we have, just look at different cultures that have totally different ideas of morality, and he gave us a few examples. But I think that's not a close enough look. I think that it's a subtler thing than that, and that if you spend some time thinking about it, that's not the case. So surely there are people have different moral opinions, and there are a couple things to say about that. One is the fact that people have different opinions about what's correct doesn't mean there's no correct answer. Right? So, which, like, we do science, right? Right. We do science, and we don't say, there are so many opinions about this, there's just no right answer. We just live in a scientifically relativistic world where you have the science that works for you and you guys have science that works for you. Or math. We live in a mathematically relativistic world. You guys have your math and we have our math, and you just can't mix them. We see how that would be silly. But when it's moral judgments, I think because most of us make the way that we do our moral processing, when we do call it moral calculation, because of how we do that, because we're so untrained in dealing with actual ethical and moral problems, that it feels like an opinion. When you imagine any moral thing and go, how would you react? And the way that it comes to your mind, how you would react, feels like an opinion. It doesn't feel like, my daughter Celia loves to give me, she calls them math facts. Papa, what's 117 plus 92? And she'll do that for an hour, and it's the most irritating, wonderful thing. The process that my mind goes through to answer her math facts questions feels nothing like the process that my being goes through to make moral judgments. Do you get what I mean? One of it feels like one of them I'm using my mind, and the other one I'm using my opinion-making mechanism. So I think that lets us down because what we're saying, what the three of us are saying is, no, there are facts of the matter with respect to moral questions and moral statements. They can be true or false. And we look around the world and go, well, look at how people express their various moral opinions. They're all different, therefore there must be no fact of the matter. And because I'm not using my mind, it doesn't feel like I'm using the thing that makes objective judgment about the world when I do my moral reasoning, it feels like maybe there's no fact of the matter. But if we look at any of those instances, I mean, I found that when people give me examples of these culturally different moral judgments to tell me, therefore, morality is at least culturally relative, I found that if we just spend a little bit of time with them, we find out that there really is no difference really in the main moral principle. So I'll start with an easier one to deal with, and then maybe one of you guys can try and deal with the one that Endre gave us. But an easy one might be people in India don't eat eat cows. And so, and in the United States, we have vegans and people who don't eat meat for certain reasons, is for different reasons than certain Hindus don't eat cows. But I have no problem eating beef in my house, and have an Indian friend who might have a severe problem and wouldn't eat beef in my house and wouldn't offer me any in hers. And you go, look, we have this moral difference of opinion. She thinks it's wildly immoral to eat beef, and I think that there's no moral problem with that. With that necessarily. So there's an example of a difference, and therefore that's a morally relative claim. It's not true or false. You just have, and then you expand it to the scale of culture, and you say one culture has this beef eating thing and another culture doesn't. Well, if you look at the moral principle involved, it really doesn't have much to do with eating cows necessarily, as far as my Indian friend is concerned. With her, the reason that she doesn't eat, you don't eat cows, is because it's possible that your ancestors have been reincarnated as those cows. So the moral question isn't really whether or not we should eat cows. The moral question is whether or not we should eat grandma, right? I'm sorry, I don't mean to make it silly or flippant. I mean that like truly, literally, that the spirit of grandma could be inside of that cow, so we don't eat it because we could be killing and eating grandma, and that has all kinds of repercussions in their religious system. So then now ask me and my Indian friend, who's your moral judgment about should we eat grandma? And it turns out we agree at that level, right?
Sure, yeah.
So the difference that we have, the difference between us is not a moral disagreement. It's a disagreement about who grandma is, right? It's a disagreement about a different kind of fact. We agree on the moral fact. We disagree on the location of grandma. So it turns out that we disagree on something like a scientific fact, right? Like where we disagree is not on the level of morality. Where we disagree is on the level of particulars. And I think that in almost every case, now there's some difficult things to figure out, and there's some gray areas, and there are ways that we say, okay, as humans and cultures and society, like how do we live out the moral truths that we believe, and that's all kind of messy. But I think in each of these cases, we deal with what's the moral disagreement. Well, it turns out that we have widespread moral agreement, and we disagree about a different kind of a fact. So that's exactly what I have in mind when Endre says something like, we just have different, like when it comes to defending yourself. And here's what self-defense looks like. I go, well, okay, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's play with that a little bit and see what's the actual moral principle at play. And I would tell you, I mean, I can't think of an example where it didn't turn out like this. So I don't want to say all the time just because I can't. That's not who I am. But I can't think of a counterexample where it turns out we have the same moral principle and we disagree about some other kind of fact that implies how we should behave in the light of a given moral principle.
Yeah, because even as you're explaining that, like, it definitely shed some light on another issue he brought up, which was abortion, right?
Yeah.
And how the difference of like people who are pro-life, like ourselves, will definitely have would be like, well, no, like, abortion is taking human life, and he was saying that in Norway it's not really that big of a deal. They mostly just look at it as a medical procedure. Yeah, but if we get at bottom, like if we just ask pro-choice people and pro-life people the question, right? Like, is it wrong to kill babies, right? Both camps would say yes, right? But what we disagree on is what is a baby, right? Right. We just
Imagine. Don't imagine me doing this. We'll do this. Is a thought experiment. It's a thought experiment. But I say I'm going to execute my daughter. You go, whoa, you can't do that. Well, why not? It's just a medical procedure. The difference of opinion, it turns out we'd all agree, no, you can't kill children. That's a bad thing to do. But then what's the nature of the thing I'm killing and the procedure that it takes to do it? Or someone who goes, we just see it as a medical procedure. Oh, you have the wrong facts. That's what I would say. So I would say, you just have the wrong facts. It turns out it's not merely a medical procedure. It feels very medical, and because of the setting. But the procedure that's actually happening is you're terminating the life of an early development human person, and which is a baby, right? So you're terminating the life of an early stage of development human person. Is that okay to do? And then we usually kick the question up a step or something. Like I would just say no, that you don't have warrant to do that. and then whatever. So then there's the point is not the abortion debate. The point is, no, we disagree about the facts. So if someone goes, it's a medical procedure, it's like having a wart removed. And I said, no, it's not having a wart removed. Did you know you're actually killing a human being? You are. I had no idea. And when we can agree about the facts, then that actually illuminates whether or not we have a moral disagreement. I think in most cases, we don't. And you'll notice in the abortion debate, that's where the debate kind of, I mean, once you blow away all the political nonsense, it turns into, well, what is this thing? You go, it's not an abortion, it's a pregnancy termination.
Right.
Or it's not murder, it's whatever. It's not a human, it's a clump of cells. It's not a human any more than an acorn is a tree, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
You go, okay, so what we're disagreeing about is the nature of the thing being killed. We don't have a moral disagreement. We agree you can't kill babies. I'm saying that's a baby, and you're saying it's not a baby. Our disagreement turns out is about a different thing than the actual moral principle involved.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And that definitely helps in not just that debate, but really in any debate, to talk about okay, well, let's actually talk about the facts involved. And because people's consciences all come from the same creator.
He brought up gun use. And he goes, American, he didn't say this, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I'm just making an extreme argument for the purpose of illustration. But they go, you Americans are gun crazy. And you can't be gun crazy because, look, you kill all of these people. And Americans might say, no, we're gun crazy because, well, whatever. Because people might come and try and hurt me, and I have a right to defend myself. And what's the moral principle at the bottom of that is you're not allowed to kill people.
Yeah.
You can't murder people. That's an immoral thing to do.
Yeah.
And the disagreement is about, okay, well, if you have all of these guns and a culture that prizes gun ownership, you're more likely to kill more innocent people, and that's morally bad. And someone on the other side of the debate or that argument might say something like, no, I would never kill an innocent person, but because I have such a value for human life, namely mine and the life of my children and my family, I want to protect myself and them against somebody who would mean them harm. And so we agree about the moral principle about the value of human life and whether or not you're allowed to murder people. We disagree about some other kind of effect.
Very interesting.
That's pretty cool.
It's
just that's awesome to hear because, first of all, it just points to the fact that the moral law, God's law, is written on our hearts. So I think that's all. You've never said everything you just said in front of my ears until just now. So I'm like, oh man, that one's cool. Just to understand and see how that I think totally is truly planted in our hearts, and we're accountable to it because we can pick it apart and see how clearly written on our hearts the moral law is. But then just in addition to that, I was thinking about an analogy you use a lot, which is if God just created us as robots, or if we lived in a cartoon universe, which I feel like is essentially what we would be living in if the moral law was any more apparent to us. If it was more apparent than written on our hearts, to where we can talk and realize that at bottom, that's what we're hitting. And it was written in the sky for everyone to see constantly. Then basically that would be a cartoon universe where, our free will is taken out of the equation. And so I see how God is safeguarding all these different
isn't it interesting? He allows for real, actual moral virtue.
Yeah.
In order to have a universe with moral virtue, you have to have creatures who can choose to be virtuous or vicious. And so, and as a creator, you'd have to strike exactly that balance where there's enough understanding of virtue that people understand it and they recognize its goodness and its value, but enough opportunity to be awful that you can actually choose to be virtuous. And so that's why we don't say about things that don't have free will, we don't call them virtuous or not, right? You see some, there are these wasps that lay their eggs inside of a spider's body, and we can say ew, but we can't really say that that's immoral because that thing doesn't have the ability to express moral virtue. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sorry, so I don't mean to take your time, but yeah, I think that's a really excellent observation. That if the moral law is too clear, then we lose the opportunity to actually express real virtue because we because we lose the opportunity to make a choice. Yeah.
Yeah. And just like understanding that that's where the gray area comes in. Like the gray area is the genius of God to give us this balance where we can not be robots, but we can be reasonable people who, So awesome job, God.
High five, God.
Was there any other things? We are kind of running up on time here, but anything else that kind of Endre talked about in his interview that we wanted to kind of comment on? There's some kind of heavier topics or whatever, but I didn't want to just throw all the ones on the table. Anything you've got for us that you wanted to reflect on?
These are all really long trails for us to run down. Do you want me to bring up one?
Let's pick one of them.
Yeah. Okay. I do have, before we finish, I do have one that I'd like to bring up. It's what I talked to you guys about as we left the interview.
That's one of mine.
I definitely want to.
If you can just run down that trail, then that'd be awesome.
Let's go for it.
So I actually got the example from J.P. Moreland, and I don't know. It sounds like the kind of thing he developed, although I'm not certain. But he was talking about the meaning of life, and he said, imagine I invite you over to my house to play Monopoly, and I tell you, but actually we play by different rules. So you get your piece, and we have the game board, but when it's your turn, you can roll 1 or 2 dice. You can roll 10 dice if you want. You can go make yourself a sandwich. You can go take a nap. You can put your feet up and watch a movie. You can move the hotels and the houses wherever you want. You can take them off the board. It's sort of up to you. Okay, that's hard to understand, but all right. And so you roll and you do your regular you play, right? You roll and you go that number of spaces and you do the regular Monopoly thing. And then the next person comes up and rolls 10 dice and then flips the board off the table and then goes and takes a shower and goes, all right, Bailey, your turn. And that's weird. So you decide to set the board back up, put things back sort of as best as you can remember, and you roll and you do the regular Monopoly thing. And then when it's my time, I don't even roll at all. I say, for my turn, I'm going to go take a nap. And I go in there, all right, your turn, Jacob. And the point is, you can understand the thought experiment, is every move is absurd, and they're not goal-oriented at all. And each person gets to decide for him or herself what their participation in the game looks like. And so that I don't belabor it too much, I can ask the audience, you could do the thought experiment yourself and just modify it to the extent that you need to so that it all makes sense. But the purpose is to understand that if the game has no purpose, right? So the point is we're playing a game that's purposeless. We're not playing according to any rules that have a purpose anymore. If the game is purposeless, then any individual action is meaningless. And if we write that large, if the universe is purposeless, then any individual life or any individual action, and you can't, the sum can't be greater, the whole can't be greater than the sum of its parts. So any number of added actions can never be meaningful because there's no purpose. And that would be to say that the universe would be analogous to that non-rules, purposeless version of Monopoly, and therefore no person's input in the game, because it ceases to be a game because it doesn't have a purpose. No person's input has any ultimate meaning. And I just like that as a thought experiment. We have to. So then, what do we do? Right, that's what we talked about with Endre. Do we whistle while we work, or do kind of what Endre said, which was do what makes sense, what makes me feel good, which seems right to me. And I would say I would agree with the thing. Like, I think he probably has a decent moral compass and has the right idea about right and wrong and what's valuable and what's virtuous. But that's because he's made in God's image, not because he is the product of mindless chemistry that now has coalesced in the right way, and he's a part of the universe as a chemical reaction.
Well, not even the right way, a way.
A way. Well, in the way that produces that kind of result.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's a very because I mean that's basically just how I think about that worldview. I mean, like, push the rock up the hill. Well, why do I have to push the rock up the hill? Why do I, why don't I just like push it sideways, or why don't I just keep punching the rock? Is my meaning, like, there's no rules to the game. I don't have to whistle while I work. I don't have to work. Like, it's just all like, it's just, there are no rules. It's all just absurd and meaningless and horrible. And, yeah. What about you? Some thoughts on that?
Just my only thoughts were, the thing that brought up that conversation was I was trying to ask him what an atheist or a non-Christian, what reasonable answer they would give to the existence of desire or just the search for purpose that's like observably universal from person to person. We all like purpose is a big deal, and CEOs hit a point in their life where they burn out, or the riches that they have don't satisfy them. They're like, what am I made to do? And like everyone asks that question. So I was asking Cam, like, how would you, if you believed in evolution, how would you explain that? Like, how would this phenomenon, this universal, be a part of our evolution that we can never satiate this desire? Like, what? And then Cam told me that analogy to basically say, like, I don't think they can do it. That's why I believe in God.
I don't think you can.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Very interesting, guys. I think that's actually about like what we got for today. But really interesting reflections on these ideas about how would our lives change if we stopped believing in God tomorrow, the meaning of life, morality between cultures, like all great stuff, all stuff to think about. I hope anyone who's listening at home, I hope it was able to help you in some way, shape, or form. And if you have any other questions about it, please comment down below and subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, right? And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. God bless.
Thank you for watching this episode of Word First Radio. If you like the podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. If you want to learn more about Word First and how you can support the ministry spiritually and financially, check out the links in the description below. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Word First Radio, and we'll see you again next week. God bless.